Someone I want to see.
My friend Sherlock Holmes.
221B Baker Street.
Hello there. Welcome to my review of The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes, Series 2, Episode 5, The Red-Headed League. This is one of the most highly regarded Holmes stories, and for very good reason. It is a classic Holmes story, and with it, Doyle set a template that he would return to for some later stories. This is something that many writers will do if they write a particularly excellent plot. They'll often mine elements of that plot structure in other stories. It's not a bad thing, as long as the new story isn't just a complete remake of the original, and Doyle did this with varying success a few times over the course of writing Holmes. Our prologue here is a seemingly typical Victorian street scene. A man watches a secured carriage make a delivery to a bank. After the delivery, one of the security guards drops a receipt of what was delivered, which the man retrieves and takes to an unseen figure. Before we cut to Mr. Jabez Wilson, sitting in 221B as Holmes reads a paper and lets out an uncharacteristic giggle. Watson enters and apologizes for interrupting before Holmes insists enthusiastically that he come in and hear Wilson's story. Holmes does his usual deductive party trick, which initially astounds Wilson until Holmes explains, at which point Wilson finds it amusingly simple.
I thought at first it was something clever, but now I see there's nothing in it after all.
Much to Holmes's disgust. Watson explains.
Everything becomes commonplace by explanation.
Which is actually a negative translation of what Holmes says.
Omne ignotum pro magnifico.
The literal translation is, everything unknown is taken to be magnificent. The idea being that if you don't know how something works, in this case Holmes's deduction, it seems magical. However, if it is explained to you, even if it takes great talent and skill to do, it seems pedestrian. This also happens to be the central theme of the plot. Wilson needs Holmes's help because he doesn't see what is happening, but Holmes does, and it's then up to Holmes to find out why. Wilson gives a detailed explanation of his situation, which is told mostly via flashback and is fairly complex, but to summarise, he is a pawnbroker who employs an assistant, Vincent Spaulding, but only because Spaulding agreed to work for half wages, and who uses Wilson's cellar as a darkroom. Spaulding brought his attention to an advertisement in the paper, which Watson reads aloud.
On account of the bequest of the late Ezekiah Hopkins of Lebanon, Pennsylvania, USA, there is a vacancy open which entitles a member of the League to a salary of £4 a week for purely nominal services.
Wilson was reluctant, but applied, and despite fierce competition, was successful. He was interviewed by a Duncan Ross, played by Richard Wilson, in a very funny scene.
You will, I'm sure, excuse me if I take an obvious precaution. Tears in your eyes. I perceive all is as it should be.
Ross tells him he is to work for 4 hours a day, 6 days a week in their offices, copying out the encyclopedia, but cannot leave the building during those hours. This continues for 8 weeks, but the morning that he is visiting Holmes, without notice, the office closed permanently. He looked for the business address of Mr. Ross, which turned out to be a company that makes artificial kneecaps. Watson and Holmes can contain their laughter no longer. And Wilson becomes quite offended by them finding humour in this prank.
If all you can do is laugh at me, well, I can go elsewhere.
No, Mr. Wilson, please sit down. I wouldn't miss this case for the world.
We don't regularly see the pair openly mocking one of their clients, but I think it's justified here, as no real harm has come to Wilson, and as Watson comments, he has been paid well and learned a great deal about words beginning with A. Holmes suspects there is more to this than a practical joke, as amusing as he finds Wilson's gullibility, and questions Wilson about Spaulding, whose description puts a fire under Holmes. It would appear Holmes has solved the entire case from 221B, but still wants to ruminate on the exact details and check a few things out. Something this story really has going for it is that we get all of the information needed at this point to be able to work out exactly what's going on. This is more of a riddle than a mystery, and is eminently solvable for us as it is for Holmes. There aren't many Holmes plots that allow for this without further details being required, but when they do come along, there is an added element of fun to see if you can work it out before the inevitable explanation. There are one or two details we couldn't possibly know that help Sherlock reach his conclusions, but they are more peripheral in terms of knowing what's going on. Even if you can't put all of the pieces together, it's made pretty clear that Spaulding is up to something, and is directly connected to the business of the Red-Headed League. As Sherlock ponders, we see Ross again, this time without red hair at all. He was the very fake sort of redhead he accused Wilson of being. He tells an obscured figure about the business of the League being ended, and then addresses him as Professor, who anyone even the least familiar with Sherlock Holmes should be able to identify as Professor Moriarty. Now, this is a departure from the original story, where Moriarty isn't involved at all, but is put in here as a tease for the next episode. Normally, I don't really like when they insist on inserting Moriarty into stories he has no business being in, the recent BBC series being incredibly guilty of this. But here, it makes sense, as they aren't adapting the stories in order, and never adapted the Valley of Fear. Back at Baker Street, Holmes has done his thinking and springs into action, visiting Spaulding at Wilson's shop, only to ask him for directions, before deciding to watch a violin recital. This seems like an odd diversion to take in the middle of a case, but as he seems to have this one wrapped up, it is the chance for a little more character work, and for Watson to further set up the episode that follows.
When I saw him, so enwrapped in the music, I felt that an evil time might be coming upon those whom he had set himself to hunt down.
I'm not sure how much of this premonition narration works, but then as Watson is writing these stories, it's believable enough that he wrote this story down after the events of the next, and is taking slight creative liberties. After the concert, Holmes summons Jones of the Yard, and the managing director of the bank, Mr. Merriweather, who we saw briefly in the prologue. Holmes has told them the bank is the target of robbery, and the man responsible is John Clay, who Jones describes as a gentleman who has turned against his class to become a common criminal.
He's as cunning as the devil, slippery as an eel, and he's turned crib cracking and forgery into a fine art.
This is an incredible turn of phrase that sums up the Victorian age, where it was inconceivable that the upper classes could do anything wrong, as they were just too well bred. A notion we have thankfully shaken off in modern times. And while the Victorians were responsible for a lot of good science, they were also responsible for a lot of pseudoscience, particularly where eugenics was concerned. Despite Merryweather's reluctance to believe Holmes, the four men go to the bank's vault, where Merryweather reveals they are storing thousands of pounds worth of gold. This makes the robbery much more significant than Holmes first thought, and makes him believe Moriarty is involved, allowing him to explain to Merryweather and us who Moriarty is.
He is the organizer of half that is evil, and nearly all that is undetected in this great city.
Which saves some exposition time in the next episode. After some time, Holmes hears what he expects to, and asks that the lamps be put out as he puts the shutters down on his own. There's a lovely character moment here where Holmes seems to be about to flip the shutter down with his cane, but then pauses and uses his hands, realizing that the cane will make too much noise. It seems like an actor's choice rather than direction, but it's absolutely perfect for the character. A moment later, Spaulding, who is really John Clay, comes through a hole in the floor with his accomplice, who manages to flee back down the tunnel to the waiting police. Clay is delightfully arrogant, only to be taken down a peg or two by Jones, after insisting being called Sir due to his royal blood.
And be so kind as to say sir and please when you address me.
All right. Would you please, sir, mind marching upstairs, where we'll get a cab to transport your highness to the police station?
We get a final scene with Moriarty, thoroughly put out by Sherlock's intervention, before Holmes wraps up the story for Watson, who doesn't quite understand what has happened. Holmes explains he recognised Clay from Wilson's description of Spaulding, and knew the Red-Headed League was a distraction to get Wilson away from the shop, so he could dig a tunnel to the bank. Details he later confirmed in person when he visited Spaulding at Wilson's pawnbrokers. The last shot is Moriarty watching Holmes and Watson as they return home. This is a fantastic episode. The central mystery is a relatively simple one. Distract someone with an offer that seems too good to be true so they don't get in your way, the plot of which is laid out before us step by step. It's handled with a light touch, with plenty of fun to be had out of it, as well as intrigue, and the addition of Moriarty to the story is not at all distracting. While it does remove some of the agency from Clay's character, I don't think it's ridiculous to believe he is one of Moriarty's agents, as he is described in the original stories as a dangerous and cunning criminal, the fourth smartest man in all of London. The cast are all brilliant. Roger Hammond is perfectly believable as Jabez Wilson in a role that could easily be overdone. Tim McInerney's switch from Spaulding to Clay when he's caught is perfect. There's not a weak link in the entire cast. In high definition, it's pretty obvious that quite a lot of the men waiting to interview for the League do just have their hair painted a bit red, but the filmmakers weren't to know these would ever be shown on huge TVs, and Ross does say some applicants try to cheat by painting their hair, so I think I can forgive that. There's little else to criticise in this episode, though. The extensive flashback is well integrated to the plot. Holmes and Watson have a reasonable amount to do, and there are some great little details, like the mention of this being a three-pipe problem that will give Sherlock Holmes fans a kick. Maybe it's a little heavy-handed in how it sets up the next episode, but it has been a series that moved forward chronologically from the beginning, and this does give the episode the feeling that they're setting something exciting up, so I really can't complain about that either. This is a clear 5 out of 5 for me. Thank you. Goodbye.